On July 14, 2026, the United Arab Emirates officially recorded 49.8 degrees Celsius in the desert region of Hamim. But that is not the number Dubai should fear most. The more disturbing number, hiding inside the climate data, is just 31. How can 31 be more dangerous than nearly 50? The answer reveals the most deeply hidden crisis facing the ultimate luxury destination. Dubai did not defeat the heat. It merely built enough doors to escape from it. Every time an automatic glass door slides open, a countdown begins. This countdown does not care how much money was spent on the skyline. It is a strictly biological clock, dictating how long a human being can exist safely under the Gulf sky. The illusion of a naturally livable desert city is becoming impossible to maintain. Today, we are going to look beyond the record-breaking tourism arrivals and the sparkling real estate brochures. We are going to examine the exact moment the environment begins to win against the human body. When we talk about extreme heat, we are usually talking about dry air temperature. Numbers like 48 or 50 degrees Celsius create excellent headlines and shocking photographs of melting pavement. But air temperature alone is a fundamentally incomplete measurement of danger. It does not tell you whether your sweat can actually evaporate. Dubai is positioned at a geographic intersection that creates a unique atmospheric trap. It is caught between the endless heat supply of the Arabian desert and the massive moisture engine of the warm Gulf waters. The desert provides the thermal energy. The sea provides the humidity. When these two forces combine, they create a condition measured by the wet bulb temperature. Wet bulb temperature asks one brutal question: can evaporation still carry heat away from the human body? Imagine holding a wet towel in the middle of a bone-dry desert. The dry air will rapidly pull the moisture out of the fabric, cooling it down almost instantly. Now imagine taking that same wet towel into a bathroom that is completely filled with hot steam. The air is already saturated with water. The towel cannot dry, and the heat remains trapped inside the fabric. Human skin operates on the exact same principle. When the air is saturated with humidity, your sweat loses its mechanical power. The water simply pools on your skin, trapping the heat inside your core. Would you rather stand in 48-degree dry air or 41-degree air, where your sweat has entirely lost its power to cool you down? For decades, scientists believed they knew the final theoretical line for human survival. That line was broadly accepted as 35 degrees wet bulb, but recent physiological studies show that line is beginning to look dangerously optimistic. We are conditioned to think of 35 degrees wet bulb as a universal barrier. It has been presented as a single magical threshold where survival suddenly ends. But the human body is not a standardized theoretical model running in a perfect laboratory. The reality of the street is much more complicated and much less forgiving. Your personal limit changes based on your age. It changes based on your gender and underlying cardiovascular health. It changes based on whether you are standing in direct sunlight or hiding in the shadows of a skyscraper. Crucially, it changes based on how much physical movement you are forced to perform. An older tourist wandering away from a luxury mall has a significantly smaller safety margin than a healthy young person. A delivery worker riding a motorcycle under direct radiation faces a completely different biological reality than an executive sitting in a shaded vehicle. Studies published in recent years have recalculated these limits by placing real people in controlled environmental chambers. The findings are unsettling. For many demographics, the actual threshold where the body loses its ability to halt core temperature rise is not 35. It is much closer to 31 degrees wet bulb. 31 is not a universal death switch. It is a profound warning that the body's margin of safety is collapsing. The heat does not need to kill you to make a city unlivable. It only needs to make ordinary outdoor movement fundamentally unsafe. A tourism economy cannot function if walking 2 blocks to a restaurant becomes a medical risk. But even the wet bulb number hides one more critical danger. It ignores the fact that the human body produces heat of its own. To understand why outdoor life in Dubai is facing an existential limit, you have to watch what happens inside a person who steps outside. When a tourist leaves the air-conditioned safety of a hotel lobby, the body immediately recognizes the hostility of the environment. The first stage of resistance begins within seconds. Blood vessels just beneath the skin begin to dilate rapidly. The heart starts pumping harder, forcing massive amounts of blood away from internal organs and pushing it out toward the surface. The goal is to push the heat out into the environment. Sweat glands activate and begin pulling water and essential salts out of your system. Even if you are only walking slowly down a sidewalk, your heart rate elevates exactly as if you were jogging. Then the environment launches its counterattack. Direct solar radiation pours heat into your skin from above. The act of walking generates internal muscular heat from within. The asphalt pavement absorbs the sun and radiates thermal energy upward into your legs. The glass facades of the luxury boutiques reflect scattered radiation directly into your face, and the creeping humidity prevents your sweat from evaporating into the air. This is where the safety margin finally collapses. Your body is now absorbing heat faster than it can expel it. Your core temperature begins a slow but inevitable climb. As the internal temperature rises, cognitive functions begin to degrade. Reaction times slow down, and physical coordination becomes clumsy. Most dangerously, your ability to judge your own level of risk begins to fade. The most terrifying moment is not when the body begins to sweat. It is when the body is still sweating, and the internal cooling process has already begun to fail. The biological clock is running out. You must find the next automatic glass door. You must find the next pocket of artificial cold. But eventually the sun goes down, and in almost every traditional desert survival story, that is where the relief begins. There is a specific rhythm to life in the Middle East. Historically, the setting sun meant salvation. When the sun dips below the horizon, the direct solar radiation stops, and the dry air temperature on the thermometer begins to drop. The streets of Dubai suddenly fill with people. Outdoor dining terraces open their doors. Tourists emerge from the megamalls, assuming the worst of the danger has passed. But this sense of relief is a carefully constructed deception. The sun leaves, the heat does not. Then the Gulf sends in the humidity. As the land cools slightly, the thermal dynamics shift, and the sea breeze begins to push massive amounts of warm moisture directly into the coastal city. The dry air temperature might fall from 45 down to 38, but the relative humidity spikes dramatically. Because the air is now heavier with moisture, your sweat becomes incredibly inefficient. The heat index, the metric that determines how the air actually feels to your skin, often refuses to drop. Research measuring evening humid heat maxima near the southern Gulf confirms this specific regional phenomenon. The nighttime hours do not provide the human body with the biological reset it desperately needs. The heart is still working overtime to push blood to the skin. The core temperature remains elevated. The stress on the cardiovascular system is merely prolonged in the dark. What happens to a city when the night no longer resets the human body? It means the outdoor environment is hostile for a much larger portion of the 24-hour cycle. The Gulf brings the moisture, but it is Dubai itself that refuses to release the heat. Dubai is a masterpiece of modern engineering, but that engineering has unintentionally created a massive thermal trap. The city is constructed from endless millions of tons of concrete glass, steel, and asphalt. Throughout the relentless daylight hours, these materials do not just reflect the sun, they absorb it. The physical infrastructure of the city acts as a giant sponge for thermal energy. The towering skyscrapers limit the amount of open sky available, allowing heat to bounce back and forth between building facades instead of escaping into the upper atmosphere. At the exact same time, hundreds of thousands of air conditioning units are running at maximum capacity. These machines do not magically destroy indoor heat. They simply collect the heat from inside the luxury apartments and forcefully pump it out into the narrow streets and alleyways. When the sun finally sets, the city begins to release its stored energy. The concrete and asphalt bleed heat back into the nighttime air. Urban climate studies focused on Dubai have recorded an average nighttime urban heat island intensity that is roughly 3.3 degrees Celsius hotter than the surrounding rural desert. Dubai's towers do not create the heat wave, but once the heat arrives, the city can store it, recycle it, and delay its escape. Dubai built magnificent shade with its skyscrapers. Then it built those same skyscrapers from materials that remember the sun long after it disappears. This changes the fundamental economic reality of the city. This danger is not merely theoretical. The United Arab Emirates has already written extreme outdoor heat directly into the working calendar. You can measure the severity of a climate crisis by looking at how a government alters its labor laws. In the United Arab Emirates, the outdoor environment becomes so physically dangerous that it must be managed by federal decree. Every year, from June 15 to September 15, the government enforces a strict midday break policy. From 12:30 in the afternoon until 3 o'clock, outdoor labor under direct sunlight and in open areas is generally banned, with specific exemptions for emergency technical work. This is a necessary and life-saving policy. But from an economic and urban planning perspective, it is a massive structural concession to the environment. In Dubai, summer is not only a season, it is a restricted operating schedule. The construction sites pause, the machinery stops. Workers must retreat into shaded rest areas, equipped with fans and cooling hydration. The city is forced to organize its massive economic momentum around the unyielding limits of human biology. Providing shade water and mandatory rest is no longer just an ethical responsibility. It is the absolute minimum requirement to prevent systemic collapse of the labor force. The economic cost of pausing outdoor industries for several hours every single day for 3 months is immense. Projects are delayed, and logistical chains are disrupted. But the alternative is mass physiological failure. The climate is actively dictating the terms of economic productivity. But what happens to the people whose jobs cannot simply pause? What happens to the urban ecosystem when the delivery of goods and services must continue, regardless of the wet bulb temperature? There are 2 completely different versions of Dubai operating simultaneously during the summer months. The first Dubai is a seamless bubble of artificial climate control. A resident can wake up in an air-conditioned apartment. They can walk into an air-conditioned elevator, which drops them into an air-conditioned parking garage. They drive an air-conditioned SUV to an air-conditioned office tower. For this demographic, the extreme heat is nothing more than a visual phenomenon seen through a tinted window. Their actual outdoor exposure is measured in seconds. But this frictionless luxury requires a massive invisible army to maintain it. The second Dubai exists entirely in the heat. It is populated by the motorcycle delivery riders bringing iced coffees to the office towers. It is the maintenance crews fixing the external air conditioning compressor units on rooftops. It is the security guards, the sanitation workers, and the people waiting at crowded bus stops because they cannot afford a taxi. For these residents, the heat is an inescapable occupational hazard. They do not have the luxury of a glass door closing behind them. They must navigate a city designed primarily for cars while wearing heavy protective gear or uniforms. To me, this is where the phrase unlivable heat stops being abstract and becomes a measurable social divide. The exact same ambient temperature can be an inconvenience for one person and a life-threatening medical risk for another. Thermal inequality is rapidly becoming the defining characteristic of modern desert urbanization. The ability to purchase access to indoor cold dictates your quality of life and your life expectancy. Yet eventually both versions of Dubai depend on the exact same fragile mechanism. Both the luxury executive and the exhausted delivery rider rely on uninterrupted artificial cooling. We need to change how we talk about air conditioning in the Gulf. Air conditioning is no longer an appliance that provides comfort. It is a critical life support system that sustains millions of lives in an environment that actively wants to reject them. When a city reaches extreme wet bulb temperatures, the cooling grid is the only thing preventing a mass medical emergency. The hotter the outdoor environment becomes, the less room the cooling system has to become optional. This life support system requires a staggering amount of energy. According to recent data, the peak electricity load for Dubai's utility network reached 11.39 gigawatts. That is an increase of nearly 6% from the previous year. Simultaneously, the peak daily demand for desalinated water hit 487 million imperial gallons. Every drop of that water required massive amounts of energy to strip the salt from the seawater. This creates a terrifying loop of dependency. The city burns energy to cool the buildings, which pumps more heat into the streets, which requires even more energy to combat. Consider the scale of the vulnerability. Imagine a localized grid failure that shuts down the cooling systems of a major residential district for just a few hours during a peak heat wave. The heavily insulated glass towers would rapidly transform into vertical greenhouses. The indoor temperature would climb relentlessly. Tens of thousands of people would be forced out onto the streets seeking relief. But the streets offer no relief because the night air is heavy with coastal humidity. The survival of the entire urban population is entirely dependent on the perfection of the engineering. The machine can never stop, and this dependence reaches directly into Dubai's most visible economic product, which is international tourism. Dubai is highly dependent on its global image as a premier destination. In 2025, the city welcomed a record 19.59 million international overnight visitors. This number is celebrated as absolute proof of economic invincibility. But beneath this staggering volume of arrivals, there is a growing tourism crisis tied directly to the climate. The heat does not need to make the tourists disappear entirely. It only needs to make the outdoor experience impossible. When a tourist arrives in July, they quickly realize that walking between attractions is a physical impossibility. The picturesque outdoor promenades are abandoned. The public squares are empty. The city effectively shrinks into a series of disconnected indoor zones. A tourist vacation becomes a highly orchestrated logistical transit between one air-conditioned box and another. You leave the hotel lobby in a taxi to arrive at the mall basement to walk into the indoor ski slope. The outdoor world is reduced to a hostile transit corridor. This puts enormous financial pressure on the hospitality sector. Hotels must run maximum cooling just to keep the lobbies habitable. Retail stores in open-air districts see their foot traffic evaporate. A tourist can still visit Dubai in extreme summer heat. The more revealing question is how much of Dubai they are still allowed to experience outside. The city sells a grand romantic desert experience. Then it must spend enormous amounts of capital and energy ensuring that visitors barely feel the desert at all. The tourism model is highly vulnerable to this compression. Record airport arrivals do not matter to a small restaurant owner if the tourists refuse to walk down the street to reach the front door. That model works only as long as the cooling machine keeps running and the tourists are willing to accept a vacation lived entirely indoors. When we assemble all of the evidence, a very clear and undeniable picture emerges. Extreme baseline temperatures trigger a massive need for bodily evaporation. The high humidity from the Gulf strips away that evaporative power. Direct sunlight and physical movement completely erase the body's safety margins. The concrete city stores the heat and refuses to let the night cool down. The economy is forced to manage the weather through strict legal schedules. The population retreats behind glass doors, leaving the outdoor world to those who cannot afford to escape it. And the entire survival of the metropolis rests on an electrical grid that must continually expand to fight an escalating war against the atmosphere. Dubai did not make the desert naturally livable. It made outdoor exposure temporary. The outdoor survival limit is not a distant line waiting to be crossed in some abstract future. For more people, for more hours of the day, it is already becoming the rigid boundary around which Dubai must organize its entire existence. The automatic door slides open. The heat rushes in. The clock starts ticking. And the city holds its breath, waiting to see how long the machinery can keep the desert outside. The story of Dubai is often framed as a triumph of human ambition over geography. But geography is incredibly patient. The physical limits of the human body cannot be negotiated away with better marketing or taller buildings. As the global climate continues to shift, the periods of safe outdoor existence will grow shorter. The cost of pumping cold air into the desert will grow higher. The pressure on the tourism sector to provide endless indoor entertainment will become absolute. Dubai is not collapsing into the sand, but its fundamental relationship with the natural world is fracturing. A city is not naturally livable when stepping outside your front door starts a countdown. The true wealth of a city is not measured by the height of its towers, but by the ability of its people to stand safely in the light of the sun. This documentary provides an analytical perspective on urban climate challenges based on publicly available physiological research, meteorological data, and urban infrastructure reports. Conditions vary significantly based on individual health-specific locations and times of day. Hypothetical scenarios regarding infrastructure are used to illustrate systemic dependencies and do not represent confirmed future events. This video evaluates broad systemic pressures and urban policies. It is not intended as personal health advice, travel guidance, or financial consulting. If a city is livable only when its cooling systems never stop, has it truly conquered the climate or merely hidden from it? I want to know what you think about the future of extreme weather urban planning, so leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you value documentaries that look beyond the skyline and dig into the real pressures facing modern megacities, please subscribe. The next warning sign is rarely where the brochure tells you to look.